6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people for whom for 6 years and 1 day there was hell on earth. Hitler imagined sealing his empire along the AA line.
Anyone caught of the line he planned, which ran from Archangel in the north on the White Sea to Astrakhan in the south on the Caspian Sea, would be enslaved. A lot of people would be exterminated.
When the good weather returned in the spring of 1942, Hitler would renew the offensive that had floundered in the suburbs of Moscow and drive for the AA line, for the Caucasus, for Stalingrad. In the spring of 1942, the Axis controlled over a third of the population and mineral resources of the world. But the war was not over.
In order to understand 1942, we need to understand that in 1941, the Germans had failed to defeat the Soviet Union.
There were 51 German divisions across Europe and a further 167 on the Eastern Front. They included various Axis partners and sympathizers. 21 non-German divisions swelled the army for Fallblau.
How do you achieve in 1942 with less resources what you didn't achieve in 1941? And Hitler's solution is economic. He sees Operation Blue, so the German summer offensive for 1942, as seizing vital raw materials in southern part of Russia, predominantly oil.
For Barbarossa, Italy had contributed 62,000 men. For Operation Blue, Mussolini increased this to 230,000, placed between the Hungarian 2nd and Romanian 3rd armies to stop those allies from fighting each other. The main offensive would be carried by von Bock's Army Group South. The prize would be the Caucasus. And the jewel in that particular crown was oil.
If you look at the distances that Operation Blue is going to have to traverse, it is 500 kilometers from the starting point in the eastern Ukraine all the way to Stalingrad. Stalingrad is only the gateway to the Caucasus. The distance from Stalingrad into the Caucasus is another 300 kilometers.
In a preliminary action, von Manstein's 11th Army attacked in the Crimea. 4 days later, the Russians launched their own offensive, Timoshenko commanding the Southwest Theater, exploiting the salient that had been created south of Kharkov. Germany had plans to nip out the salient. The Russians beat them to it by 6 days.
The Russians launched a preemptive strike, which was a disaster.
When von Kleist attacked with 15 divisions and von Paulus brought the 6th Army in on the flank, they trapped the Soviet forces in the pocket they had tried to exploit. Only 22,000 Soviet troops managed to escape the encirclement, and the main German offensive began.
The Germans did not have the resources for a whole front offensive in the second year. So in the summer, they had resolved to strike in the south.
Blue 1, the attack on Voronezh, was to initiate a cascade of conquest. By July 7th, Voronezh had fallen. Blue 2 would strike towards Rostov. The Red Army in the south collapsed. Axis formations flooded the area. The confidence this generated encouraged Hitler to divide his forces. On July 23rd, issuing the directive that Chief of Staff General Halder in his diary termed
both ludicrous and dangerous.
Hitler had several talents which made him a successful leader. One, of course, was this complete self-belief, which basically would carry him through everything. I think one should always be very frightened of people who are completely self-taught. Autodidacts with obsessive ideas are extremely dangerous. Mussolini was another one. And still was Stalin.
Halder wrote,
The chronic tendency to underrate enemy capabilities is gradually assuming grotesque proportions.
Half the army would head south to the Caucasus oil fields and would really take away Russia's ability to drive its industry and to fuel its vehicles.
From his new HQ, Werewolf in Vinnytsia, an ill-chosen site with heat, humidity, and swarming mosquitoes, the Führer committed the newly divided force to an advance on divergent axes. Army Group A along the Black Sea coast, aiming for the crucial oil cities of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. Within 12 days, Group A had advanced more than 550 kilometers. Hitler ordered Army Group B to advance on Stalingrad.
That hub was a Volga River port we have come to know well, Stalingrad, the pride of this generation of Russians, for it was their city, built in their time.
Von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army reached the oil fields at Maikop on August 9th. On the following day, von Paulus crossed the Don, reaching the outskirts of Stalingrad and opening his assault on August 19th. When the assault on Stalingrad began, anti-aircraft guns had been entrenched for use on advancing tanks. The gun crews were almost all young women, and they were almost all killed. 1.5 million Soviet women served in the armed forces, around 490,000 in frontline roles, where they were granted one benefit not available to their male comrades: an additional 100 grams of soap.
They dropped more than 1,000 tons of bombs on the city. In the city at the same time, there were around 400,000 people, and during the first week, 40,000 died.
Stalin's order number 227 simply demanded not a step back. It ordered,
Panic makers and cowards must be liquidated on the spot.
To many of Western people, they will tell you because it was totalitarian system, because everybody was afraid, because everybody had the soldier with a gun. But you know that in the reality it's impossible. You cannot find such number of people to shoot their own compatriots.
13,000 Soviet soldiers were executed for desertion or cowardice during the Stalingrad campaign. Forced to strip before being shot, so that their uniforms, destined for reuse, should not have demoralizing bullet holes.
There is one thing we should say about Stalin's style of administration, style of governing. He was ruthless.
Stalin reopened the churches. For the first time since the revolution, officers were to be addressed by rank. A large order from the USSR was received in Great Britain for gold braid. It was, Stalin said,
not just decoration, but also about order and discipline.
So as the war went on, Stalin gave more space to his leaders and became better. Hitler did the opposite.
On August 23rd, the Germans reached Stalingrad's northernmost suburb. On the outskirts, they found a hospital for mentally handicapped children. Ordinary soldiers of the Wehrmacht shot all of the 10 to 14-year-old patients.
So clearly, the German soldiers went into the campaign with a certain mindset of anything goes.
On August 27th, Stalin, the Supreme Commander, appointed General Georgy Zhukov, the 42-year-old son of a shoemaker, Deputy Supreme Commander, and sent him to Stalingrad. Lev Kazovich was one of the soldiers sent under his command.
Доехали до Камышина на поезде. Дальше пути были все разрушены. И от Камышина до Сталинграда тоже шли пешком. Это примерно 100 километров. Причем двигались только ночью. Это был август месяц 1942 года. Двигались ночью, днем немцы бомбили всякое движение.
On August 31st, following a conference at Hitler's headquarters, General Halder noted,
the Führer has ordered that upon penetration into the city, the entire male population be eliminated. Since Stalingrad, with its 1 million uniformly communist inhabitants, is extremely dangerous.
The women, Halder continued, must be shipped off. He did not say where to. Willy Peter Rees, a bank employee from Duisburg, served on the Eastern Front, was wounded twice, and wrote prose and poems. In 1942, he wrote,
murdered the Jews, marched into Russia as a roaring horde, sabred in blood, led by a clown. We are his envoys.
On September 11th, von Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, was at the Werwolf in Vinnytsia to brief Hitler on his plan to take Stalingrad. The attack went in at 6:30 on September 14th. At noon, Axis troops had reached the city center. The main railway station had changed hands 5 times. Over the next 3 days, it changed hands 13 more times.
A large part of the 6th Army and the supporting Panzer Army are in Stalingrad itself. The Russians there are fighting tenaciously a defensive war.
October 11th was a pause as the Germans drew back and prepared for the final assault, which came on the 14th. 300 tanks led the charge into the acres of ruins. Journalist Vasily Grossman recorded the sounds of the battle.
Action stations, get ready, comrades. Tommy gunners coming through on the left flank.
The defenders held. Door to door, room by room. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War.
Although Stalingrad is in ruins, the city has obeyed the order to hold out at all costs. Hitler's main strength has been concentrated here, but the Russians have fought for every yard.
And the biggest mistake was to allocate panzers and so many troops into the city itself. They were actually responding to a Russian campaign of defence. That was the mistake. They didn't even need to be in the city.
We have to mention the bravery of the Soviet soldier, of the Red Army, because unfortunately, Soviets have no idea how to think about the soldiers. They thought that, well, Russia is very big, we have a lot of women, and they will born a lot of soldiers. Soviet officers have no idea how to survive these soldiers. So they just send them in the massacre.
The assault paused on the 15th and resumed on the 18th. On the 21st, Field Marshal Keitel said,
"The Führer is convinced the Russians are collapsing."
The Germans were trying to obliterate the city, and of course that creates rubble. And as other battles in World War II demonstrated, where you've got rubble, you've got a problem for attacking troops, particularly if they rely on armour, and a natural protection for the defending troops.
On November 8th, commemorating his failed beer hall coup, and speaking of Stalingrad, Hitler told his supporters,
"That is what I wanted to capture. And do you know we got it? There are only a few more tiny pockets left."
On the 11th, the German offensive reached the banks of the Volga on a 500-meter front. Ice was drifting in the river, and the Soviet reserve, of which the Germans were unaware, was over 1 million men, with 979 tanks, 14,000 guns, and 1,350 aircraft.
Все это делалось в большой тайне от немцев. Немцы так и не почувствовали, что приближается момент, когда немецкая армия будет окружена. И, наконец, 19 ноября 1942 года.
У нас под Сталинградом морозы были до 50 градусов. Представляете, это вот такой декабрь, там вот это, к январю уже двигалось. 50 градусов. Палатки. А нам-то в танках мы моторы не глушили. Так что нам от мотора даже было тепло, а потом мы через выхлопную трубу так рукав откроешь, и тебя это немножко обогревались вот таким способом.
On the morning of November 19th, ever after known in Russia as Artillery Day, the earth shook almost 50 kilometers from the bombardment as 13,541 Soviet guns opened Operation Uranus in thick fog and driving snow.
Вот наша артиллерия заговорила и в течение 30 минут долбила по немецким позициям.
Стоял такой грохот, который мы еще не слышали во время боевых действий до того.
Залп дали «Катюши». Обнимались, радовались. У некоторых слезы радости были буквально. Наконец-то мы не будем отступать, понимаете? Да, но мы продвигались и продвигались вперед.
Within 24 hours, 65,000 of the targeted Romanian troops were prisoners.
What the Russians were able to do at that point is strike at the weak link in the German chain, which were the supporting armies, the Hungarians and the Romanians, on either side of the Sixth Army.
On the 20th, a second assault began south of the city. Encirclement was clearly intended, and to avoid this, von Paulus, on the 21st, proposed withdrawing towards the Don. Hitler's response, issued from Berchtesgaden the same day, was an order to stand firm. The Sixth Army, the largest formation in the Wehrmacht, was trapped in the Stalingrad Kessel, 55 kilometers by 30. On the 22nd, encirclement was completed. Von Paulus sought permission to break out, but Hitler refused.
We must not give it up now under any circumstances. We won't win it back again.
Arthur Schmidt, Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army, offered a feeble assurance to his beleaguered troops.
Just hold out. The Führer will get us out.
In Stalingrad, life became increasingly difficult. Many German soldiers died, not only due to the fighting, but also because of the extreme cold, because of lack of food, lack of provisions. So it became an ordeal.
On December 12th, the Germans launched Winter Storm, an attempt to break through to Stalingrad. The operation made good progress for 2 days. Meanwhile, northwest of Stalingrad, the whole of the Italian 8th Army and most of the Romanian 3rd had been wiped out.
Romanians were fighting for their territories, but the Italians, they were fighting for nothing. They were brought here in order to help Germans conquer this country. From their paradise, yes, from Italy, they were brought to the snow. It was a kind of tragedy for them.
On the 19th, Winter Storm, having got to just over 60 kilometers from Stalingrad, was checked. And on the 20th, Hitler accepted that von Paulus could neither escape nor be rescued. 300 flights a day were needed to supply the trapped Sixth Army, with fighter aircraft transferred to defend the Reich against the Allied bombing campaign, and transports sent to North Africa. Fewer than 30 were achieved.
The army needed 700 tons of cargo every day, at least 500. And not even half of that would be food. It would be everything, ammunition, everything. What they were getting, though, was 85 tons per day.
On January 8th, Rokossovsky sent an ultimatum. Von Paulus contacted Berlin.
Request immediate permission to surrender in order to save lives of remaining troops.
Ordered by Hitler to fight to the last man and the last bullet, von Paulus rejected the ultimatum. The following day, Rokossovsky issued the order.
Rokossovsky was intelligent and well-educated, and I think his methods of war were more effective.
On January 10th, Operation Ring launched 280,000 troops, and 250 tanks in a final assault on the Kessel. On the 22nd, Paulus radioed,
"Supplies all gone. What orders should I give to troops that have no more ammunition?"
On January 24th, the Red Army overran von Paulus's last airfield and his last hope of supply. On the 30th, in a radio broadcast, Goebbels said,
"1,000 years hence, every German will speak with awe of Stalingrad and remember that it was there that Germany put the seal on her victory."
They turn it into a martyr's cause, as it were, to try and hide the reality of this shattering defeat, the Sixth Army. Everybody knew it was a turning point.
Потому что все время грохот, пулеметные очереди, рвутся снаряды, а тут тишина. Мы завершили, наступила абсолютная тишина. Даже как-то непривычно было.
Because no German field marshal had ever surrendered his command, Hitler promoted von Paulus. The field marshal's baton was dropped by air. The next day, the field marshal surrendered his command. Hitler called it
an about-face on the threshold of immortality.
Von Paulus took a different view.
"I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal."
Stalingrad was the last time they fought on equal terms. After Stalingrad, the ratio was 2-1 against the Germans. So they never retrieved the balance of forces that required on the Eastern Front.
There are a bit of a conflicting numbers of how many Germans ended up in the Soviet captivity. 91,000, 98,000, 101,000, 102. But we know for sure that by 1955, when the last ex-soldiers of the Sixth Army were released from the Soviet captivity and went back home to Germany, only around 6,000 made it.
German state radio played the Adagio from Bruckner's Seventh Symphony in memory of a lost army. In 1945, it would be played again, following the announcement of Hitler's death. After Stalingrad, the Axis still controlled more than 2,200,000 square kilometers of the USSR and ruled over the 65 million people who lived there. It would take a further 18 months of fighting before the invaders were expelled.
Stalingrad, while a great victory for the Red Army, it still has the German armies deep inside the Soviet Union. And the idea that the Red Army is one day going to push them all the way back to Berlin still seems like a long, distant prospect.
Stalingrad is the moment in which people on the German home front, in a critical mass, start to blame Hitler personally for negative developments in the war. They don't blame other members of the Nazi hierarchy. They don't blame other circumstances. They start to point the finger at Hitler himself as the author of this disaster.
But the disaster that most threatened morale in the Reich was not events in faraway Stalingrad. It was that their own cities were being destroyed. At the start of the war, it had been hoped that bombing would be conducted according to strict rules. But on August 24th, 1940, an off-course Heinkel bomber dropped its bombs in error on an unintended target. They were the first bombs to fall on London. Winston Churchill, convinced that it had been a deliberate attack, ordered Berlin to be bombed. Arthur Harris was head of RAF Bomber Command.
Winston's attitude to bombing was anything to put up a show.
Churchill championed.
An absolutely devastating, exterminating attack by heavy bombers upon the Nazi homeland.
Studies done by the British military for the British government and by the Home Office suggested that if the bombers started coming over the main centers of population, society would break down. People would panic.
We are in a position to carry into Germany many times the tonnage of high explosives which he can send here. And this proportion will increase all the summer, all the autumn, all the winter, all the spring, and so on, till the end.
Pre-war British projections anticipated a casualty rate of 50 casualties per ton of bombs dropped. In the event, the death toll for the London Blitz was 1 per ton, and the overall death toll in Germany was half that.
For a large number of bombing theorists, there was this expectation that air power was a totally new technology that was going to revolutionize the nature of warfare.
But accurate bomb aiming, pinpointing such targets as factories and rail junctions, was beyond current competence.
It's quite ironic, really, because Britain, who has managed to defeat a German bombing campaign through a very well-integrated air defense network, wanders off quite naively to try and attack German industry.
The Butt Report, analyzing the effectiveness of Bomber Command's actions in the summer of 1941, found that only 1 in 4 bombers had dropped their loads within 8 kilometers of their targets. On nights when there was no moon, it was 1 in 20. A new strategy, reflecting the technical limitations, would be adopted. Cities were large targets, difficult to miss. The new strategy was called area bombing. Area bombing became policy following the directive of February 12, 1942, and to deliver it, Arthur Harris, one of the most controversial of Allied commanders, was appointed on the 22nd.
War is a race, and the prize is victory.
Harris's job was defined in the area bombing directive.
To focus attacks on the morale of the enemy's civil population, and in particular, industrial workers.
Harris was, until the very end of the war, unshakable in his belief that bombing would bring Germany to her knees, that the disruption to industry and the effect on civilian morale, victims of what was euphemistically called dehousing, would hasten the end of the war.
The civil population of Germany have, however, an easy way to escape from these severities. All they have to do is to leave the cities, abandon their work, and go out into the fields and watch their home fires burning from a distance.
In 1942, area bombing absorbed 1/3 of Britain's military expenditure and 1/3 of national output, largely the production of heavy bombers.
There is a received wisdom that the Allied bombing only strengthened German resolve.
Germany had a first taste of what she had tried to give England, saturation bombing.
I actually find this hard to believe. I've read so many accounts written by Germans who experienced the bombing. I think it was a nightmare that is really difficult for us to imagine.
The Allied air raids increasingly shaped everyday lives of ordinary Germans, particularly from 1942 onwards. Because after 1942, the number of air raids and the intensity of bombing
Essen was first attacked on the night of the 9th of March. And then, on March 28th, 29th, the RAF attacked Lübeck. 234 aircraft attacked. 13 were lost. Lübeck was virtually lost. Lübeck was a port where engines for U-boats were manufactured. It was also an historical, medieval, beautiful city, and it was laid waste.
And some of the targets, I'm sure, were picked at the last minute. We bombed a little tiny town on Christmas Day that they thought might have ammunition being stored there. It was a shame to bomb it.
Germany responded to raids on their historic towns by targeting similarly historic British cities, the so-called Baedeker raids. Harris's escalation in response to Baedeker was the first 1,000-bomber raid, to which he committed his entire front line and all of his reserves. That raid targeted Cologne. The operational order was succinct.
Object: to destroy the city of Cologne.
If you individually succeed, you will have delivered the most devastating blow against the very vitals of the enemy. Let him have it right on the chin.
Never seen so many aircraft in the air before in my life. I looked down over the target, nothing but a sea of fire.
At the start of the war, the population of Cologne was 750,000. By the end, it had fallen to 40,000. Barely 2 days after Cologne, an equally massive raid hit Essen, and at the end of June, Bremen was the target.
And I can remember seeing the sky just filled with airplanes. It was really quite a sight. How effective it was, I don't know.
On the night of July 24th, 25th, 1943, a massive raid hit Hamburg. It was Operation Gomorrah. The devastation of Hamburg consumed an area 100 times greater than the devastation in Cologne. Lieutenant Hermann Bock was in command of a flak battery. He saw
a sky so absolutely hellish that it is impossible to even try to describe it. No noise heard by humans could be heard. It was like the end of the world.
There are morale reports saying that soldiers think, well, here we are fighting against overwhelming odds at the front, and back home our wife and kids are being bombed out of house and home.
A 15-year-old girl remembered.
Mother wrapped me in wet sheets, kissed me and said, "Run."
But for most of those flying the missions, there was no doubt.
It was never a question of we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't be doing this, never.
The raid on Hamburg destroyed 22 square kilometers, creating almost 43 million cubic meters of rubble, on which people wrote messages in chalk.
Wir leben, Hilda. Wo bist du? We are alive, Hilda. Where are you?
The death toll over 4 nights was at least 42,000. 31,647 corpses were recovered. RAF losses were 87 out of 3,095 sorties, and the United States Army Air Force, in 2 daytime raids, 39 out of 337. Lord Casey watched a film of the devastation of Hamburg with Winston Churchill.
All of a sudden, Churchill gives a start and he says to me, "Are we animals? Are we taking this too far?"
The British Bombing Survey Unit concluded that even the mounting toll of casualties failed to break the hold with which the Nazi Party had over the German population. But following the raid on Hamburg, Albert Speer said,
"The depression among the population was extraordinary.
It was perfectly obvious to the German population and to those serving in the German armed forces that the tide of war was turning against them.
In Japan, the devastation caused by bombing was greater than in Germany because, as Time magazine observed,
Properly kindled, Japanese cities will burn like autumn leaves.
the end of the war in Europe would allow the Allies to throw all of their resources at Japan. Spearheaded by the B-29 Superfortress, a weapon more expensive to develop and deploy than the atom bomb.
The monster flying machines roared down the runways and took to the air. 300 of them in all zoomed up into the skies on their mission of destruction. Rendezvousing overhead, they pointed their slim needle fuselages toward the Japanese mainland.
In the firebomb raid on Tokyo on March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of mainly incendiary bombs, which incinerated homes made from paper and wood. More than 41 square kilometers of Tokyo burned. Officials estimated the death toll at 130,000. The number has been queried and revised, but remains the greatest loss of life from a single event in the whole war.
The great fire raids consumed Japan. 66 cities are swept by hurricanes of flame.
More than 250,000 buildings were destroyed, and more than 1 million people made homeless.
Majority of the damage was done by incendiaries, and something like 3/4 of the city is estimated to have been wiped out.
After the raid, Tokyo looked, according to Major Shoji Takahashi, like
the biggest and most devastated battlefield one could imagine.
bombing sent 8 million refugees on the road. 66 Japanese cities and towns were hit. By the summer, the B-29 fleet had reached 600 aircraft, but it was running out of targets.
And things really are, in Japanese cities, really teetering on the edge. People start dying of diseases which are made worse by malnutrition, and the old and the young are affected by starvation.
The morality of area bombing over Japan and in Germany continues to be debated. Its targeting of civilian populations without regard to age or gender has led to comparisons with the slaughter of the Holocaust. Bombing was used by all sides because all sides believed that area bombing could and would be a war-winning weapon. And when the war stopped, the bombing stopped. But if victory had gone to the Axis powers, the destruction of people on the basis of race and religion would have continued. In the end, it's not the flattening of a city or winning of a battle that settles a war. Policy, the grand strategy, ultimately determined the outcome of the war. And in every capital, except Tokyo, it was not in the hands of the generals and the admirals. The decision-makers were the political leaders. At the beginning of 1943, a sequence of conferences began that would shape the war and the peace that would follow it. The first conference at Casablanca between Churchill and Roosevelt was in January.
They discussed our offensive strategy for this year, in which it's intended to hit the enemy smashing blows on new fronts.
Briefing the press after the conference, Roosevelt said,
"Peace can come to the world only by the total elimination of German and Japanese war power."
Roosevelt's statement ended any chance of a negotiated peace. By the time the conference caravan had moved to Cairo, Allied troops were fighting on European soil. On July 10th, Allied forces in North Africa had launched their invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky put 115,000 British and 66,000 American troops ashore to face a garrison of 315,000 Italians and 50,000 Germans. After a month of bitter fighting, 60,000 Italians and 40,000 Germans successfully evacuated to the mainland. Unlike Dunkirk, the Germans succeeded in preserving their equipment and took more than 9,000 vehicles and all their heavy weapons with them. The conference caravan moved on to Tehran, the first meeting of the Big Three, and the first time that Joseph Stalin had traveled abroad.
A terrific conference, planning to make certain of the destruction of the German forces in the shortest possible time. And these are some of the men carrying responsibility for that most desirable objective.
Tehran is interesting, too, because it really shows the extent to which Roosevelt was willing to, in a sense, push Churchill aside as a means of showing Stalin that the Americans did not march lockstep with the British. He thought that was very important, that Stalin understand that.
Roosevelt, I think, had an elevated sense that he could manipulate Stalin. But actually, Stalin was the shrewdest of the three of them when it came to hard-nosed diplomacy.
At the Tehran conference, Roosevelt began proceedings by outlining Overlord, the plans for the Normandy landing, to a delighted Stalin.
It was really, in the end, yet another example of how Europe first was the American motto.
The British never reconciled to what their Prime Minister called
the bloody Second Front.
I think Churchill wanted to postpone the evil day of putting his own troops up against the very, very hardened divisions of Nazi Germany.
In 1944, the bloody Second Front would open. But the year would open with a decisive campaign on the other side of the world. Which the world knows little about.